Hey there, my name is Macy Miller. My background is in architecture, and over the last 15 years, I've spent a lot of time working with occupants, builders, and officials navigating tiny houses, which is ironic because the houses are quite small. It's the conversations about where they fit that have become surprisingly vast. In 2011, I built this 200 square foot tiny house on wheels for myself. I still live in it today with my family. Since then, I've become involved in both the practical and regulatory side of this housing type, including work on IRC Appendix Q tiny houses, now called Appendix BB, and more recently on the ICC 1215 standard effort. Over that time, I've watched demand for this type of housing continue to grow, even without a clear code pathway. I'm here today because I believe these homes fit directly within many NAHB members' purview, and I'd like to clarify how chassis-based tiny homes can fit within the IRC framework without lowering expectations or expanding the scope, and why that's necessary. The defining advantage of a relocatable tiny house is not mobility. It's the ability to separate the cost of construction from the cost of land. In many markets, land cost has become the largest barrier to housing access, not construction costs. Building on a chassis is a practical way to remove that barrier. For some households, this can be a stepping stone to traditional homeownership, and for others, the flexibility for changing work, family, or living situations is the appeal. In places like Boise, Idaho, we're seeing the concept of an ADU pad emerge, where a landowner prepares a site and the occupant brings the structure. This allows housing costs to be divided among parties, and homes can be added incrementally to different properties within existing neighborhoods and zoning rules. While these homes can function as primary dwellings, most function similarly to ADUs, and despite the name, these homes are typically not often relocated in practice. Most remain at a single location for years at a time, with relocation often occurring only after compliance concerns arise and no pathway to approval exists. The absence of clear code is suppressing builders, not demand. These homes already exist in large numbers across the country, mostly outside of the professional building system. Not because builders aren't interested, but because unclear code creates liabilities they can't reasonably take on. Tiny homes are intentionally small rather than low quality, usually incorporating customized layouts and higher-end residential finishes. Without a clear path to hire a professional, most relocatable tiny homes are being built by owner-builders or family members. Even so, people continue creating these arrangements because these houses solve real and practical needs. The ability to relocate the structure when family, caregiving, or property needs change is part of what makes this model desirable. With an IRC-aligned code pathway, there's so much more opportunity for professionally built relocatable housing to fit within existing neighborhoods. These homes can support first-time homeowners, aging parents, caregivers, students, traveling professionals, workforce housing, and more. Across the country, jurisdictions are exploring ADUs, infill housing, and other small housing reforms because the need is real and the housing is already being used. In the absence of IRC-compliant pathways, some jurisdictions like Portland, San Diego, and Oakland have begun relying on RV occupancy as a part of their housing strategy, using frameworks that were never intended for long-term residential use, and creating avoidable life safety and oversight concerns. A clear IRC pathway would instead allow these housing needs to be addressed through fully IRC-compliant relocatable homes. These homes are often classified as RVs, not because they function as RVs, but because the presence of a chassis has historically complicated their treatment in the IRC. The important distinction is less about whether a structure can move and more about how it's intended to be used and regulated. RVs are designed for temporary recreational use and operate under a different framework than the IRC. HUD homes are federally regulated and centered around factory construction, which limits local control over how they are placed and used. What's needed is language that aligns relocatable tiny homes with the IRC and preserves local control and local approval pathways. Fundamentally, these homes are just small IRC-compliant dwellings. The difference is that instead of being supported only by a conventional foundation, they can be supported by an engineered chassis and anchorage system that serves the same purpose of transferring loads safely to the ground. Importantly, there is no need to expand IRC scope. The need is simply to clarify how IRC-compliant structure can be supported and anchored when constructed on a chassis. In this context, the chassis is not functioning as a vehicle within the building official's scope. It functions as a structural base supporting the home through an engineered anchorage system. The structure above the chassis is IRC-compliant and attached to the chassis through an engineered connection. The chassis is engineered to address transport loads, and the anchoring system is engineered for site-specific load conditions. The goal is to give local officials a clear way to approve and inspect these homes when they're built on a chassis. And like the IRC-compliant home above the chassis, structural elements from the chassis to the ground can also have prescriptive pathways. By contrast, the developing ICC 1215 standard is focused on a modular pathway that operates through separate manufacturing, certification, and inspection frameworks. The IRC appendix approach is narrower and focused on how IRC-compliant homes constructed on a chassis can be approved locally as a dwelling. To be clear, this is not about regulating vehicles, expanding IRC scope, overriding zoning authority, or replacing HUD pathways. This is not intended to shift transportation liability onto building officials or to create a separate alternative building code. It's also not dependent on the developing 1215 standard. This isn't replacing conventional housing. It's serving people who often can't access conventional housing today and providing a clear IRC-compliant pathway. This creates a pathway for contractors and builders to participate in a housing segment that's currently happening outside the professional building industry. These are not a separate class of housing. They are directly within the capabilities of conventional single-family home builders. The demand already exists. Clear code language opens the door for that demand to access the builder ecosystem. There are some practical advantages for builders as well. In hot and cold climates especially, these homes can often be built indoors, helping crews stay productive year-round, even when weather slows on-site construction. Because the homes are smaller and faster to complete, they diversify project scales and help maintain workflow between larger projects. They also create opportunities to use leftover materials from larger builds, reducing waste while creating usable housing. Most importantly, this opens access to a market that cannot currently participate in conventional home ownership. The tiny house appendix already exists, and that's important because jurisdictions can choose whether and how to adopt it based on local needs and priorities. In terms of life safety, structural strength, and energy performance, these homes are required to meet IRC provisions. When IRC Appendix Q was approved in 2016, it already established the limited set of allowances necessary for tiny homes, primarily reducing ceiling heights, modifying stair geometry, and allowing the use of sleeping lofts. Notably, at that time, those allowances were based on the transportation limitations associated with relocatable structures. The tiny house appendix has now been adopted in 2/3 of the U.S. The issue is not whether IRC recognizes tiny houses. It already does. The remaining question is simply how tiny homes constructed on chassis systems can be consistently reviewed and inspected within local residential pathways. They are the most prevalent tiny house type for good reasons. To close this, these are simply IRC-compliant homes serving a growing segment of the population. Their unique advantage is the ability to separate the cost of construction from the cost of land, creating incremental and attainable pathways into housing, while also maintaining local inspection and approval. I hope I've clarified the value these homes bring to the broader housing landscape and how clear code language can bring this market to professional builders without lowering expectations or expanding the IRC. Several code proponents involved with the language brought forward during CAH2 and PCH are on the line with us today, and we'd be happy to open this up for questions. I'd also welcome feedback on what would be needed for this type of a proposal to gain broader support within NAHB moving forward. Thank you. I appreciate your time today.